I'm Ryan Jeffrey, and this is the Passionate About OSS podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to shine a light on some of the brilliant minds in the OSS and telco industry, about their background, knowledge, and also to uncover some tips and techniques they've developed along the way and share with you, the audience. With today's guest is a CEO and founder of an OSS and BSS vendor. He's a strong promoter of open source and cloud native movements with involvement with LFN and some of the other standard bodies as well. He's got a strong hands-on involvement with the code still, so even though acting as a CEO and founder, he also gets time to get really hands-on with the code. He and his company specialises in OSS, which is online charging systems, and particularly for the MVNOs. He's highly knowledgeable about mobile technology with a long history in it, including 5G. He's helping to flesh out some of the standards with 3GPP, the mobile standards body, TM Forum, also more recently with LFN. So welcome to today's guest, Vance Shipley.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you for having me.
So you've been running SigScale for a little over 5 years, but your involvement in telco goes back way further than that. It goes back to somewhere like 3 decades. And knowing a little bit about your story, there are many twists and turns and achievements that in their own right would take a few hours for us to dive into in your early career. So what we'll probably do is just touch on a few of the key points. I believe you started telco as a high-tech lumberjack. Tell us what that term is and how that came about.
Yeah. Well, that's really the genesis of my career, which has really been focused on the telco space and never left, or at least the communication service provider space. And so the genesis was I dropped out of high school, and I really wanted to grow up quickly, and felt I needed to have a job and make some money to gain some independence, and so rightly or wrongly, that was a decision I took, and I had a guidance counselor who tried to help me with that path. My ambitions about what sort of work I would get were very modest, but he asked, well, what would you really like to do? What job would you, if you could have any job, what job would you want to do? And I, for whatever reason, said, I wanted to be a telephone man. And I guess my reasoning was probably that the guy climbing the poles in the backyard and hanging wires and making phone calls from the top of a pole was impressive, some sort of a high-tech lumberjack, and it appealed to me.
Hopefully not chopping any of the poles down like a lumberjack would, though.
Well, I did have a couple come down, when you're, so I went into cable television. He couldn't get me into Bell Canada at the time, but he managed to get me into Rogers Cable, which was a bit of a surprise. And there was a sort of a government program that provided some level of sponsorship, and I guess that was really the advantage that got me in. But I started climbing poles within a few months of that as one of the things that I would do. And we would rewire apartment buildings. So we'd rip out all the old wiring and put in new wiring in like a day for pay television, because I needed direct runs for that. And so we used to, going back to the lumberjack, we used to have to cut the old drops, the wires that ran from the span to the building. And sometimes those poles were not as solid as they looked. And on one occasion, I cut one of those drop wires, and the entire pole came down and was just hanging by the span. It was an interesting day for me.
Absolutely. So it was a bit of a load-bearing catenary wire.
Yeah.
It's actually holding the pole in place.
And that ended up being what it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So you spent a couple of years in cable co, and then you made the transition into looking after PABXs before having your first real NMS experience and getting closer to what we look at in the OSS world.
Yeah, so that was my third job. I moved from cable to TV to interconnect business, which was a new business. Deregulation was taking place, and so you could buy your own phone systems for a business where you didn't have that liberty before. And this is in Canada, where I'm from, I should say. And so I did that for a few years, but I was still it was a very blue collar job, and got quite dirty. And a lot of times we wired all the foundries in Ontario, and it was just filthy. And I wanted to move into a more white collar job. And I taught myself to do some programming, and that balance of having the detailed knowledge of telephone systems. By that point in time, I was actually a PBX engineer and programming PBXs. And so, and when I say programming them, that's what we called it, but it was really provisioning. And so that was attractive to a company called Linton Technology Group. Went on to become Switchview, and they had a very unique. They were a startup. They had a very unique relationship with Nortel, who was at the time, one of the biggest providers of digital PBXs and key systems in the world, as well as central offices, Canadian company. And
in fact, it was the leading company on the Canadian Stock Exchange for a while there too, I believe.
Yes, yeah, very, very important company for Canada. Unfortunately, on now. We had a technology sharing agreement with them, which was very unique, and it was a contract with no expiration date, which was some sort of a coup. But the company was started to really do network management systems for those PBXs and specifically networks of those PBXs, because if you look at large enterprises and government, that they will use their own private branch exchanges with their own trunking between them, et cetera. And they have their own phone networks. And they're large and complex, and they have the same sort of challenges on a smaller scale that communication service providers do. And so we started out by having basically a graphical user interface to what was a command line interface offered by Nortel.
Which that would have been quite novel at the time.
It was completely novel, and we did that. It was very successful. I started traveling around the world, being the guy. So I worked in a software company where everybody was a software developer, but none of them really understood the phone network that well. And I was the guy who understood the phone network very well, who knew enough about software to be able to have a conversation with the two groups, because back in those days, unlike today where we've got total convergence now. Right, the software is eating the network, right? But back then, you had computers and you had networking equipment, and they didn't meet very much. Just a couple spots, they bump up against each other. And I ended up focusing my career around that. If you take a Venn diagram, that overlapping bit, which was very, very small initially when I got started, and that has always been where my career has focused, is in between there.
Yeah, and so that migration to the coding world, was that purely based on the fact that you wanted a white collar job, or was there some other interest and other drivers that made you take that path too?
I like to answer that with a true story. So when I was installing PBXs, we had installed a PBX for a company in Cambridge, and the way the sales guy had sold it he didn't get the engineering support that he needed, and so there ended up being a problem. And the problem was that the branch office kept ending up with tromboned trunk lines, and so basically you'd start out at the beginning of the day with a couple dozen lines between the offices, and then they would get hung up. So that by the end of the day, you were down to only a couple, and it was a real problem. And the solution just needed a manual intervention. So my job became at the end of every day and at the beginning of every day, I'd have to log into the command line interface over a modem and tear down these trunks. And so I was supposed to be doing that at 8:00 in the morning before everyone else arrived. And it meant I had to get up an hour earlier, and I didn't want to get up an hour earlier. So I wanted a solution to that problem. And a friend of mine was an early adopter of Unix and the internet, and he had a SCO Xenix server on a 286, which was multi-user, and he had some modems on it. And so I was able to dial into it and use UCP, like the precursor to the internet. And so I taught myself to program in C for the express purpose of automating that job that I had to do. I did that. It took me probably 3 or 4 weeks to learn enough C to write a program and schedule it on the Xenix system. And it started running itself every morning, and I got to sleep in an hour.
And it's changed the entire trajectory of your career based on getting an extra hour's sleep?
Well, it really showed me that I was capable of creating automation and solving real problems. Yeah.
And just thinking with that mindset of automation so early on, when the tools weren't readily accessible as they are today, just shows a particular mindset that's somewhat different, perhaps, from many in the industry. But I guess that's also changing because everybody's looking at automation these days. And over the next few years, you got very, very heavy, and I guess still really are, into some of the protocol stacks. So ISDN, SS7, which is a voice signaling protocol for those who haven't been around decades like Vance and I have, signaling. And I guess in doing some of that really hardcore coding, it also opened up some really unique business opportunities and business propositions for you. Can you tell us about perhaps what some of the most important ones of those were?
Sure. This was at a time when liberalization was beginning in the telecommunications industry. So we'd already liberalized the CPE market, so you could put your own devices on the network, but we hadn't really liberalized the telecommunications operators, right? So we followed the United States a couple of years after them, and so we liberalized the inter-exchange carrier market for long-distance phone calls, and over time, like places around the world, they liberalized more and more. And so you had companies who were in that in-between space where the full liberalization hadn't taken place yet. So they had to really do novel things to be able to stay in business or to find new businesses, right? And some of those companies became very successful. Like Sprint in Canada came out of a company called CallNet, and CallNet started before you could sell long-distance phone calls, but they were able to sell long-distance phone calls because what they said was, and they're very publicly, we offer a value add. We offer accounting services. So we offer call accounting management for your long distance usage. But to be able to do that, we actually have to manage the calls. So the calls are a byproduct of this accounting service that we provide. And so, that's the sort of thinking that would go into the precursors to full liberalization. And so a lot of unique challenges for those entrepreneurial people. And you didn't have the benefit of having vendors and other support infrastructure there to support what you're trying to do, because no one had thought of it yet. And so people would come to me and have a unique business challenge they want to do as a service provider, and I would find a way to do it. And that typically leveraged ISDN, which was the digital trunking that was becoming available in the 90s. And then on the carrier side of that, we had the grown-up version of that is what we call Signaling System 7. That's how central offices and like in different cities or across the network communicate with each other. And just as I had always done, I always wanted to find the best. And so if I was doing ISDN and there was something better, well, then SS7, then I wanted to do SS7. And then as soon as I had that, I'm demonstrating some ability to do that, then people are very interested in that, and then they will ask you about the particular problems that they have. And I just built a business around that called Motivity Telecom, which I ran for about a dozen years.
And along the way, you met another serial entrepreneur, Adrian Science. So did he help inspire that entrepreneurial spirit, or was it already inherent? Had you already started up some of the companies that you talked about in that time frame?
Well, when I first met Adrian, he had one of these resellers, and this was right when we had full liberalization of the long distance market in Canada, and there was some amalgamation, and I was with ITN Corporation, and we were merged with a reseller that he had, and he briefly became the CEO at ITN, and that's where I met him, and didn't have a lot of interaction because he wasn't there all that long. But a few years later, I found myself in the next new thing that everyone was doing, which was building ISPs. People were buying Sun servers and routers and a lot of modems and building internet access businesses. And there was a lot of that going on, and not a lot of people knew how to do it. And so, for a few years, that became the next big thing. And that's when I started working for myself. I was just had too much opportunity with that going on, which I originally was trying to do as a side job, and then I decided I just, quit my job, and that's when I became an entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
So that was how I first met Adrian. Now, when I next started working with him was a bit after, a couple years later, when that initial flurry of ISPs was dying down. Adrian was starting a new business, which was the next thing to be liberalized, which was international telecommunications. That's between countries. And so it used to be that Teleglobe was the monopoly provider of international communications in Canada. Adrian created a company called North American Gateway, which was competing with Teleglobe. And again, like in most of these other things, you start by finding unique ways to compete that are legal if you interpret the rules liberally. And Adrian had a great term. He called it leading the regulatory curve. And which we'd seen CallNet do so well. Mike Kadar was the president there, and he that eventually became Sprint Canada, and it's a success story. And North American Gateway became a great success story, and he began working around the fringes, and eventually was shut down for a little while. Went through the Canadian regulator, the CRTC. The CRTC shut him down. He appealed to the cabinet, the government, and got that CRTC decision reversed, and was back in business. And eventually, that whole business became liberalized. And so we built quite a big global business. We had switching centers in Toronto and London and New York and others, and we're aggregating routes into countries all over the world. And it was an exciting time. But yeah, so in answer to your question, what did I learn from Adrian? Well, I learned to think out of the box. I learned that rules are what you make of them, and nothing is that hard and fast. So as an engineer, I'm a pretty black and white guy, and Adrian's more of a salesman, and he sees the world in a spectrum of color. And I learned to look at things a little differently from him. And one of the other important things I learned from him was that if you're going to send someone an email or have a conversation with people and you have a good thing and a bad thing to say, you start with the good thing. Don't start a conversation with the bad. And that's something I remember every day.
And were there other mentors along the way in those early days?
Oh, yeah, there were some. The founder of the Linton Technology Group was Art Linden. He had some great lessons for me, and I remember one. We were doing this this network management system for Nortel PBXs, and that company was very specifically about Nortel PBXs because we were implementing this proprietary technology, their proprietary technology, and then one day, Nortel announced that they had a product that did what ours did. And so I was pretty sure that my job was over. And I expressed this concern to Art one day. And he said, "No, Vance, you don't get it. This is the best thing that ever happened to us. We've been going around trying to convince people that they need a network management system for their Nortel PBXs. And we spend most of our time convincing them that they need a product like this. We don't do that anymore. Nortel does that. Now we only need to convince them that ours is better.
Yeah. And I guess you also look to integrate to the other platforms as well, not just Nortel's, but the other.
We did.
Yeah.
We branched out and we started doing Mitel and other Canadian manufacturer PBXs, and eventually pretty much all of them. But the Nortel market was big enough that we had specific products like the provisioning stuff that was specific to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess one of the things that's really impressed me, particularly some of your stories from those early days, is that you take something of an uncommon view. So in a lot of the people that I come across in this industry, in the telco industry, takes the perspective of building tools for the telcos, building OSS for the operators, not necessarily looking beyond that. So it comes out quite clearly in things like businesses like SkySurf, when you're looking to service or provide comms to commercial airlines, looking at Classics when you're looking at providing services to the hospitality industry. You took a perspective that was driven more by business propositions and beyond just tools for telcos. Is that something that you really drove, or that those opportunities just found their way to you?
Well, it's kind of both. Like the opportunities in their raw form pushed to me, but then I would put my spin on things and form them into what I would want to see. There is something that there's a skill that people don't seem to learn or intuit very well, and that's this. The ideation and the creation of product or service creation, as I like to call it in the communication service provider business. But that's really about and when you say those words, like people will think about a mobile service plan and how you price it or something, and that's a part of it. But there's how you use it, how it fits in with your life, and what problems it solves for you as a customer are really critical things, and the communication about that, like how are you communicating that value proposition? What pain point or pleasure point, if you will, that are you addressing? And you've got to get everything lined up so that if you build it, they won't come, they won't know where it is, right? So building it's a small part of it. You've got to have an effective message that jives with the value you're creating, and so that's always quite difficult. At Fastnet, for instance, which was the genesis of our online charging system for SigScale, I created the mechanisms to be able to create the products, and said, now what are your products, and how do you want to do this? And there was a complete lack of imagination, and I was disappointed in that. But ever since then, I've really found the same thing. Just no matter where I go, is that the imagination of coming up with actual products, and thinking about what that value proposition is, how you're communicating it to customers, and how you're changing their lives. That's a role I don't come across very often. I don't come across people really embracing that role very well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point. You used the word intuit there. So it's one thing coming up with the idea, but do you now, having been through that process a number of times, do you have something of a structured process for then taking those ideas, but then working through them to say, well, is it just something that I think is valuable, or do you have ways of figuring out how to market it, classifying the market, all those other things that lead to it then becoming a successful product?
Yeah, I'm guilty of being an engineer at my core, and so my natural tendency would be to solve a technical problem and make it a perfect solution, and then expect to reap the rewards. But it doesn't really work that way. And I learned the hard way that you really got to make sure there's a market for what you're doing, and often one of the challenges I often have is that I'm usually 10 years early. So that's that's no good, right? That's just bragging rights. You don't win in business doing that. So
yeah, it's an uphill battle pushing something that the market's not ready for or not aware of or can see the benefits for.
So I learned early on that, as much as that's that all engineers would be inclined to do, to concentrate on the technology, that if you're not solving a problem for people, that you're just wasting your time. And having wasted too much of my time in the past, I really make sure that I get that done right.
And so skipping ahead a few years now, it's probably a good lead into your current vehicle, which is SigScale. So are you able to tell us a little bit about what SigScale does and the specific niches? You touched on a little bit around the OCS and what preceded it, but yeah, tell us a little more about SigScale.
Well, I founded SigScale 5 years ago. At a time when NFV was the big new thing, and it just seemed like a really good match for my career trajectory, like with all the things that I've built through my career. It was always about that convergence, and now convergence is what NFV is all about, and it's completing the convergence, and so we have pretty much 100% overlap. And so that seemed like the area that I should be in, and I wanted to create a startup. So so I chose the basic idea of taking the opportunity to greenfield solutions for this new environment. So cloud native solutions, a term maybe we'll touch on later that meant a little bit different thing to me at that time than it does to most people today. But really, it was about greenfielding these things, and so that was the basic premise. And signaling always having been a focus, that was something I really wanted to leverage to be able to create scalable signaling systems, and thus the name SigScale. But the other aspect of that mission for the company was to be a true open source company. And that was an important part of what we did and a differentiator. And so we are, I described sort of the market that we were going into, and an important part of what we're doing is that what we are creating is intellectual property that is not licensed. Well, it's licensed. It's licensed with an Apache open license, but it's not. We don't sell runtime use licensing. That's not the business model that we have.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about how the business model does work for open source for you, some of the reasoning, the pros and cons of open source in the context of SigScale?
Yeah, so the basic driver behind the choice for open source, the business driver in terms of why the founders of this company, Adrian and myself, chose that business model is a very practical strategy for marketing. If we're a very small company with that, and we didn't want to go out and get a lot of venture capital funding, we wanted to be able to grow this thing, really demonstrate results, and so a very small company trying to do business with a very large company, you're very disadvantaged. It's very hard to do. But when your offer, your commercial offer, is so radically different than the traditional way of doing things, that it just provides a different vector. It's a different vector to get into that business, and so that was a really important part of the business strategy. Now, once having done that, I actually got the book by Jim Whitehurst, I think it is, the CEO at the time of Red Hat, and wrote a book all about being open, and really embraced all of that philosophy. Like, I knew what open source was, but he really talked about being open, about having an open mindset, an open policy, open everything, truly open, and I really embraced that. And I said, if we're going to do this, because I am a purist, I said, if we're going to do this, we're going to really do it. And so no community version, and then we keep the good stuff to ourselves, and the community, there's a watered down 6-month-old version of what you can get if you actually pay for it. None of that, right? So all of the code, there's one branch of all the code, and well, there's other branches, but there's one main branch, and that's the branch that everyone would be on, whether you're going to pay for support contracts or not. And that the idea is that, see, Microsoft took a choice, like in the early 90s or the late 80s or something. They could have, because at the time there were lots of copyright controls, dongles, little hardware things, printer port, and if you didn't have that hardware attached, the software wouldn't run. There were solutions to make sure that everybody paid for your software, but they chose not to do that. They decided that it would be fine if only 1 or 2% of the people using the software paid the full price for the software. As long as enough people were paying the full price of the software that they had a viable business, and that all those other people were just creating demand to pay for the software. It was a good strategy. It worked. They dominated the world with that strategy. But for us, I knew that wouldn't be the way it worked. I knew that in a service provider business, having commercial support was going to be a necessary thing. So that instead of, so we flipped it. And so basically it turned out to be true, that as near as we can tell, at least, that there's only 1 or 2% of people who would put our software into production who don't have a support contract with us. It works the other way in a communication service provider business. And so our real product is a support subscription, which is service assurance. It's an insurance policy that you're paying to have us there to help you when things go wrong. You're paying to have us there when you need support for anything, product creation, et cetera. And so our business is really about service assurance for the people who adopted our technology, and that the revenue from that service assurance business finances the further development of that intellectual property.
Do you have community development of that, or is that all tightly controlled within your team?
At the moment, it really is us. We don't get a lot of input from the community. Now, that's not that we don't want it. When we get to a point where there is enough interest in doing that, we'll look at setting up programs and encouraging that more. But everything is open. We're entirely open. So if you send us a fix, it based solely on merit of what you've contributed, we'll consider it for inclusion. But we don't get a lot of that. And one of the reasons would be that our technology is not mainstream. So it just cuts down the number of people who would understand how to work with the technology to begin with. And when I say about the technology, it's not mainstream in that it's communication service provider based technology, but also the environments that we use. So we do most of our work in a functional programming language called Erlang. So there's just less people who know how to contribute code for that.
And you've talked a little bit about the technology. Can you tell us a bit more about what the technology is? I know there's a few products, but there's a flagship product. Would you like to tell us a bit about what that does and the kind of customers it supports?
Yeah, our flagship product has been for most of the 5 years the online charging system, and so this enables communication service providers to do real-time charging of prepaid services. So prepaid mobile phones is really the classic target, although wireless ISPs have used it with radius protocol and Wi-Fi access points, but most of our target customer, most of our paying customers are communication service providers who are mostly MVNOs, a lot of them in the IoT space, and it's really all about this charging. So it's a AAA function. Subscribers subscribe to some kind of product which has some kind of rating, and before they're able to use a service, we need to make sure that they are authorized, that they have a valid subscription. And then using that subscription and the prices within that subscription, we decide how much the service is going to be charged in advance, because everything's done on a reservation basis. And then we'll check and see if they have balance to cover that cost. And that's that basic job. And we do that for the packet gateways and SGSNs and those network elements of the mobile phone networks mostly. But as I say, also DSL is another use case, and Wi-Fi is another use case. And in fact, one of the things that we added over the last last 2 years really, but mostly in the last year, was carrier Wi-Fi. So we're now implementing the interface to the home subscriber server, so you will perform the front end authentication using the SIMs and the devices, and then we get the authentication vectors from the HSS, and we manage that whole carrier Wi-Fi use. So that's that product.
And that seems to be a little bit of a transition from the original intent of going after the NFV market.
No, not at all, really, because the NFV was really about getting rid of appliances. So it was really about softwareization. And so we greenfielded the OCS. So it's really right on the original mission. So when we created our online charging system 5 years ago from scratch, and we decided to implement it with Erlang, and we built the whole stack. So everything. Erlang is a language that was developed at Ericsson, and there's a runtime for it, like a virtual machine similar to a Java Beam virtual machine. That's provided by Ericsson basically, and everything else. So we use that, which does include a diameter protocol stack, and everything else we've implemented without any prerequisites like databases and etc. And so the greenfielding it was the one thing, and then we made a choice at that time to use all TM Forum information models and open APIs, and so it's really spot on with the NFV idea of completely softwareizing the network elements. We chose that a couple in there, the 3GPP AAA function as well as the online charging system function.
Some of your early customers, can you tell us a little bit about the story and how they came about, the types of customers they were, and how you made connection with them?
Well, our first customer was one of Adrian's startups. So he has this wireless ISP in Mexico, and that company was getting a little bit stagnant. It hadn't really changed its offer. And so I came in and really identified that we needed an online charging system to properly run that business, to move them from a postpaid billing to a prepaid billing, which would allow them to have different products, because they only had one product, just all you can eat internet by the month, and not even tiered, right? So just one single product, and so I wanted to enable them to have an hourly guest product, all kinds of tiers, and the way things are done in a lot of places. And so I built the technology to do that. So that was that one. And one of the other early partners that we had, and we still have today, is Liquid Telecom out of Africa. They have enterprise voice. They're a big the largest fiber optic network in Africa. So they've got a varied business, but part of their business was to provide enterprise voice services. And in Africa, you have some specific challenges. Low margins is one of them, and credit risk is a problem. So basically, even though they've got a postpaid marketed service, and it's marketed in the sort of traditional way that you would do trunking into PBXs, they wanted the credit control to be the same sort of online real time that you would do for a prepaid mobile offer. And so we've delivered that for them. So it's an IMS voice application, and we run it as a prepaid service, do all prepaid rating and reservations and all of that. And then beyond that, some other partners, which I'm not at liberty to mention, are MVNOs who are doing unique things, luggage tracking and other IoT stuff, very specific IoT things.
That sounds really interesting. So, if I was speaking to somebody, what sort of phraseology would they be using that I could identify that this would be an ideal customer for SigScale?
Well, entrepreneurial people who aren't doing the normal thing, the outliers, the non-mainstream, the people who are identifying niche business and then really serving it well. Those are the people who I get along with, and they're the ones that have challenges that just there aren't 10 vendors in the market with an existing solution. So they need something specific, and this is one of the great things about open source. So because there's no capex, right? Like when you come and you decide to use our online charging system to be the engine of your revenue in your network, the good news is that there's no upfront cost for that because you can just get it from GitHub and start using it if you know how to build it, which is a challenge, mind you. But in theory, there you are. But in practice, there's a gap analysis that needs to be done. So does it do everything that you need? No, it does 80%, 90%, 98%, and there's a bit of a gap there. And so they will work with us to fill that gap. And being open source, they always have that hedge that if we can't or don't do it for them, they could hire somebody else to do it or do it themselves, right? You've always got that ability. And so those most of the opportunities are people who are really trying to leverage those opportunities.
And do you tend to find them or do they find you?
Well, that's the beautiful part of the business. So again, I said the open source was a business strategy and it was really a marketing strategy. And so that has really worked out well for us. We're still a small company, but the experience has been that we concentrate on building up that intellectual property and supporting the customers that we have. And then we just get queries coming in because people discover us through Google is the first thing. I mean, they're looking for a solution, they're Googling, they're finding our solution. And then because it's open source, like that wouldn't work if you had a commercial product, right? But because it's open source, that's the thing that attracts people. And so we'll get people coming in. So in actual fact, the really only marketing that we do in terms of monetary investment is our membership fees in the TM Forum and the events that we go to, that we participate in. And those are the things that get our name out there. People learn about what it is and what we do, and then when opportunities, when challenges come along that they need to solve, and they remember who we are and what sort of things that we do, and then they come to us.
So it's a good segue into TM Forum. I've noticed that you're a really active participant in the TM Forum. Is that in an official role?
No, SigScale is a member of the TM Forum, so we pay our membership dues, and I participate personally in several of the work streams. So the Open API project and the Open Digital Architecture project, and it's a community led organization, and so I am a team member. But I have last year I was given an outstanding contributor award, so a bit of recognition for my role, but certainly nothing official. No.
Yeah, and definitely warranted, because I can see that you put a lot of time into, I guess particularly what really stands out to me is that you appear to focus on turning some of the theories into practice. So things like the Catalyst programs you seem to be deeply involved with. What are some of the main initiatives that you're driving at the moment through TM Forum?
Well, I over the last few years, I've become the resource domain guy in a time when everyone else is very focused on network as a service, and the idea there is to just ignore the resource domain. But it's true, right? Because what they want to do is they want to be able to not have to manage the full stack, to be able to abstract it at the product layer so that you're just working with services, and that resource layer is interchangeable. It doesn't change the services. And so that's all very sound, but the resource layer still needs to be managed, and not by those people, by another department, but it still needs to be done. And so there's less interest in it. And this is the sort of thing about my career. I do not the popular stuff. So everybody's working on network as a service, and I'm kind of doing it the old school way. But that, the resource domain, as you're well aware, needs to be managed effectively to be able to have those services work the way that they're supposed to. So I do that, and I have furthered work that was done by, standing on the shoulders of giants. I've furthered some of the work that was started a couple of years ago on resource functions and managing software as a resource. So as we're going through this NFV process and, now cloud native functions, all this softwareization is going on, those things still are resources, but now it's not it's a virtual resource, right? Mm-hmm. But it has all the same information model as the old appliance version, right? So we need to manage those, but we need to now take into account the environments, the unique way that those things are supported in those environments. And so I've done a lot of concentration on that. And there's a big change going on. So in the past, we had a very hierarchical OSS stack in the network, like 3GPP networks. So you would have element management systems, and that would come from a vendor. And so a vendor would provide you say a 3G RAN or a 5G core, whatever it is, and they'll provide a management system for that equipment that they sold you. And so you don't talk directly to those elements, you go through the network management system. And then you would have element managers and domain managers, and then you would have an umbrella system being the real network management system. Well, with 5G, with the whole softwareization, with all that's going on with moving to virtual networks, we're flattening that whole thing out. So there's a new service-based management architecture in 3GPP, and we don't deal with those very macro levels anymore. Now we have management network services, and each of those services are much more, they're like microservices. So fault management or performance management would be or configuration management. Those would be microservice, they're management network services with actually component services. And you can have a function which either produces and or consumes those services, and who those consumers are, you can actually be creating in a bit of an ad hoc way. So it's not statically defined like it used to be. So the Etsy ZSM project today is really concentrating on that aspect of it. And when you start to think about closed loop control and autonomous networks, you can start to see how and why these management functions need to be lifecycle management. So a 5G slice is put into service. Well, you're going to need a management service that manages that 5G slice. So it needs to be spun up and lifecycle managed, et cetera. And it needs to talk to the network service, the management network services that it needs to support that.
I guess it must feel like almost back to the days of deregulation, that things are opening up the opportunities for innovation in and around this space. Must be really exciting.
Yes, absolutely. And the big difference is that we are moving from having 3 or 4 big global vendors to CSPs, and having really an unlimited number of vendors, more vendors than you're ever going to be able to be aware of potentially. And as long as we're building an infrastructure and an ecosystem that is open, we can achieve that.
Yeah, opening up that long tail of innovation, I think it's brilliant, seeing what things are happening in the space. And speaking of which, we talked a little bit about you being at the center of a Venn diagram between software and networks earlier on. I also feel like you're a key connector. You've got that real Venn diagram between the work that you do with 3GPP and the TM Forum. And I feel like, again, that's a fairly small intersect that you're providing real value in.
Sure. Well, I don't have an official role at the 3GPP either. In fact, I'm transparent to that group. But I've been consuming the specifications that they produce for decades. Implementing all those protocols. That really was taking the specifications that standardized standards development organization has produced and understanding them and implementing them into software. And so, it's something I'm very used to working with. And then in the TM forum, again, circumstances sort of put me on this resource management role. And so managing the 3GPP domain was very important to me. And the vendors haven't done those 3 or 4 big vendors haven't done a very good job of really making an open management network. They haven't had any commercial interest in doing so, which is partly selfishly they don't want it. They don't want to interconnect with other vendors. That's selfish business decision on their part. But then the operators have to share in the blame too, because they didn't make them. They didn't pay them to do that. They didn't force them to do that. So, they didn't require that the solution had to have that open management. So, and they bought it anyway, so they're both to blame. But even though 3GPP did a pretty good job of specifying open interfaces, that they didn't actually get implemented. But like I said, that can't continue if we're going to build autonomous networks and all these other things, right? So in a 5G core network, which is completely software, we can't do that old way. We have to have these open management interfaces. So in the TM forum, again, not that many people interested in the resource domain. Most of the interest is towards the top of the stack. So I took it upon myself to try and solve some of the problems that I saw. So I was the primary author for a document that we produced called Ep005, which lays out how to do the information model mapping from 3GPP network resource models into the TM forum information model called the SID, and to be able to map from one to the other. And then once you've made that map, you carry it on to the TM forum open APIs. And so we've actually implemented the software that does that. So I've really connected all the dots there. So we can take the information that is exported from the management systems from the vendors, Nokia and Huawei and Ericsson, et cetera, and they, to varying degrees, support bulk configuration management and exporting this description of what is in the network inventory. And so we have mapped that from the proprietary version to the 3GPP standardization version. And then once we've all normalized all the vendors into the 3GPP version, then we have a mapping from that to the TM forum information model. And then that becomes very easy to map it to the TM forum open APIs. And so then we implemented the software that does all of that as an open source resource inventory management system. So Ep005 is just a document that describes that process and how to make that work. So it's been quite well received.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's taken it from not just a paper study, but actually putting it into practice. And in putting it into practice, I'm sure you identified a whole bunch of things that you may not necessarily have discovered just in a paper study. So mappings and things like that.
Yes, well, absolutely, especially with the doing the vendor mappings and that sort of thing. And you find out that in theory we've got a model for all the information, but in practice, how much of that information was captured? And so now you've got to create solutions for discovery. And so that's in terms of product, beyond the open source software that we've created, that's kind of the value add that we've been able to do, is having the DevOps stuff that allows that to happen.
Yeah. And so to add an extra ring to the Venn diagram, you now also started up an initiative with the Linux Foundation Networking Group.
Well, yeah, I mean, I joined an initiative. So the XG Vela project was an incubator project with LFN and has recently been approved. And it's a project to provide a platform as a service for 5G network functions. It's XG, so we didn't want the name to limit us to one generation, but really,
yeah, because 5G is already so passe. You're already on to 6 and 7G, no doubt.
Well, so we had the foresight anyway, but 5G it requires a software implementation. You have to do things this way, and basically cloud native. So XGVela is, you can presume Kubernetes, and so you really have containerized network functions, and lots of people have the ability to develop those things, but that decades of history that goes into telco management takes a lot to learn, and there's just so much of it that what we're trying to do is allow software developers, application developers, to get a lot of that stuff for free. So as long as you follow the templates and follow the recipe to work within the PaaS framework that you've been provided, then you're going to automatically have a well-managed network function. So one of the things that I'm looking to do is to bring in the TM Forum APIs so that if you deploy a network function using XGVela, that you won't have to implement any, and you only have to implement your information model and make sure that you're using the facilities for configuration management that we provide, and then all of that inventory, and so the configuration management, the performance management, the fault management, you get for free, because it's you follow the information models, and we've mapped it to the appropriate APIs, and it winds up in the TM Forum OSS BSS world, or mostly OSS, or through ONAP. Those are the sort of two vectors for most of that support.
Yeah, and it's a really, really important cross-pollination function that you're doing there too, because there is so much parallelism but not complete overlaps as well between those groups, and tend to see that there's not that many people who act as cross-pollinators like yourself. So I feel like it's a really important role you're doing.
Thank you. I do. Luckily, I enjoy it.
What are some of the big challenges that you see that are still yet to be solved by our industry, and perhaps TM Forum's role, or any of the standards bodies' role in helping to solve some of those big challenges we still face?
Well, I'd like to answer that question on two fronts, and one from like the SDO side of the world. So it's really about playing nice with others, right? It comes down to it, like everything you need to know you learned in kindergarten. It's very easy to create solutions in a vacuum, but we really can't do this anymore. We need to be working to a common model of the world. And so I concentrate on information modeling, and it's an area that's not that well understood. The difference between an information model and a data model: an API, like a JSON API, is an instance of a data model. You've got a specific way to encode that information, but the information model captures what you need to know about things and how those things are related. And as long as we have that information model coherent, so that the ETSI information models and the 3GPP information models and the ONF information models cohere, then we have the opportunity to manage end-to-end services and end-to-end networks. And that is admittedly a big problem. Like it's a hard problem. It's a challenge. And one of the reasons why it doesn't tend to exist very, very well today. Just, certain areas get thing, but it's a very big area. So I would like to see more get done there. But the second thing that I would like to answer for a question is about the business. So the communication service provider business, it's a very old business, not as old as hospitality, but been around for 100 years anyway, and it has a lot of legacy. And we need to not change just the technology, but we need to change the business, and we won't get the technology changes. Like I mentioned earlier, the management frameworks didn't get well implemented and didn't become open because the business environment didn't ensure that they do. Right? So we need to make sure that vendors and communication service providers are all working together to foster a healthy ecosystem so that we can make these solutions work and work properly. It all comes down to economics at the end of the day. If SigScale doesn't have the revenue, then it goes away, and any of the dreams that we had don't come about to help out the industry. So we've really got to concentrate on having a healthy ecosystem. The RFP process and the old way of doing business that SigScale rallies against, and we've railed against it because it was sort of an opportunity for us a business opportunity, a way to compete. But we need more demand from the operators and more offers from the vendors for open source solutions and new ways of doing business. Software as a service is a new model of how you engage, but we need to go beyond that to have truly open solutions.
Yeah, and I guess even further upstream, so you talked about the revenues for SigScale, and if they don't exist, then SigScale goes away. But further upstream of that, obviously the CSPs also need to be profitable. So I guess it's incumbent on all of us to help them become more profitable. When they're more profitable, more projects flow our way, and we get to do more exciting things and change the world like SigScale is.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and I guess part of the problem is with the consumers as well. If everybody wants free internet, you just can't have that, right? I mean, you can have free internet because I'm paying for it, but we all can't have free internet. It doesn't work that way. That's not how economics work. So we have to have a viable business at all levels. Yeah.
So what does the future hold for OSS and telco, and how are you positioning for it? You've talked about some of those ideas, but would you elaborate further?
Right. Well, the main thing is what I talked about earlier about the breakdown of the hierarchy. And so when we had a small number of elements performing network management and coming from a very small number of vendors, and the new networks don't support that. We can't build autonomous networks and closed loop control and all of the analytics and machine learning and all the buzzwords that people really want to see that really have to happen, because if you have to manually provision things, then you can't have very dynamic things, and we want things to be dynamic. I mean, we want automated vehicles discovering the networks as we drive, and mobile edge services. All of those things have to be highly dynamic. And so you have to support a lot of software that comes and goes and has life cycles. So it all needs to be managed and orchestrated. So the old way of doing things doesn't work anymore. It will hold us back if we don't fix it. So the people at the SDOs and the operators, the CTO offices of the operators all understand this, but that's where we need to get to. We need to have an open framework for OSS. And so it has to be open, and it has to support this dynamic lifecycle management. And to be able to support the ecosystem, like, you can't rely on Nokia and Ericsson to build all those solutions, right? So clearly, you will have small companies like my own coming along and offering a best of breed function, just one function, right? And to get the value of that function, it has to work nicely with the rest of the functions and the management functions in the network, right? So we have to have that, and it will happen, and it is happening, and that's where things are going.
Yeah, and I feel like that coherence is a really important part of the message. And I look at it from the perspective of, we've got so many really talented people out there developing solutions, and historically there's been a lot of rework. So if you look at the inventory space, it's the same problem being solved by 20, 30, 40 different vendors, and therefore the talent pool is continually solving the same problems in different places and in slightly different ways. So finding that coherence of just one resolution to it, and everybody else building on it and bolting it into the other pieces of the puzzle, I think are really important there as well. So knowing you too, Vance, I know that you hold a few contrarian views on things. We've talked about some of them. You talk about being the 1%er. Are there any other beliefs that you hold that are contrarian views that compared with the rest of the industry?
Yeah, my contrarian views will just go against popularity and not good thinking. For instance, I think kind of the story that I tell that people don't accept is that the business that AWS and Azure and Google Cloud have today is like the internet when it started with companies like UUNet and those guys who they were businesses that did the internet. That's all they did. They didn't have voice services and et cetera. They did IP networking, and that's what they did. But they're all gone today. They've all been consumed by the traditional telcos, and the traditional telcos are where you go to get your internet service. There are no I just do internet companies anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And that's obviously just clearly what will happen in the long term with cloud services. So, infrastructure as a service. I need to host a web server. I need an environment to put it, and I'm going to have some IP addresses. I'm going to steer my DNS towards it, right? So that's a commodity thing, and to that particular thing has been more commoditized. There's more people who offer that, but all of that business will become very commoditized, and naturally the people that you're going to go to for those services are the same communication service providers that you get your cell phone access from and your voice access for your office, etc. So I see a natural progression. Like this move now towards mobile edge computing, people accept that we need data centers closer to the users if we want to do low latency, augmented reality and gaming and stuff like that. So people accept that the telcos are going to have data centers and they're going to be used to host these applications, but they don't draw the obvious conclusion that they will do that in a very general sense. People seem to think, for somehow they rationalize the idea that you're only going to have those kind of things, and that Amazon will continue to have the vast majority of that application hosting business around the world. And they're not here in the Philippines where I am today. So to use AWS, I have to go out of the country. Right? That's an unnatural business system. So my view is very simple, and that's that it's all, the cloud is coming down, it's becoming fog, and it will be all around us. And the important players for the bulk of the business for what we look at today as cloud service will be your traditional telco operators. And Google, Microsoft, AWS will continue to do things like the machine learning and big data and all kinds of value add. But for the commodity cloud services, the bulk of that will go down into the telcos.
Do you think they can do it at the economy of scale, that the hyperscalers can do that?
Well, they have no choice, right? So remember, the whole network has become software, right? So all the appliances are replaced, and what they have in terms of infrastructure, they have radios, and as you know, the radios are at the top of the tower now, right? The radios and the antenna are co-located, right? So from
they've got the real estate, yeah.
Well, they have to have the real estate, but the point being that the only real hardware that they have that aren't computers are the radios and the antennas at the top of the mast, and everything else is servers. And everything that they're doing, everything you hear about with Open RAN and 5G core and just mobile edge, all of this stuff is just software on commodity servers, or at least commodity architecture servers. And so they have no choice but to build out this capability to run a lot of software, to have the iron to run the software, because you can't take the signal from the tower and ship it to Singapore, right? That doesn't work. The physics don't allow that, right? So no, they have to build data centers, and so at the base of the tower they've got a small data center. At an aggregation point they've got another data center. Downtown they've got another data center, and if they have to build all of that for their own telco specific applications, it would be a waste to not take the investment in hardware and all the infrastructure that goes with it, and not commoditize it towards your customers. And for the idea that you were just all those customers are going to bypass all of that and go and use commodity servers in Singapore through AWS is not natural.
Yeah, you're right. One of the things I found, so with a couple of the carriers that I guess I worked with, there was almost an element of resignation that they couldn't even come close to doing a price point that the hyperscalers were doing. So we're talking factors of 10 before they could even get close to breaking even. So underpinning that perhaps is the fact that they couldn't automate and do things at scale like the hyperscalers can at the moment.
Yeah, well, I haven't said when all this is going to happen,
Yep.
and that's, I can see the future clearly. I just don't know what the timeline is. So, those are all challenges today. It's very hard to get a CFO to free up money to build data centers for mobile edge, and because there's no business for it.
Yeah.
But we're obviously going there. So this is what I say. You asked for a contrarian view. That's not a view that most people will buy into.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we're getting towards the end of the podcast here. Any other pearls of wisdom you'd like to share with anyone else starting out or even partway through their journey?
I have one really good piece of advice for anybody creating a startup in the telco space, whether it be OSS or anything else. If telcos are going to be your customer, it's probably true of a lot of different businesses, but certainly true of the telcos. Don't be fooled by the story that you're going to do this work for them to solve their problem, and you're going to do it as a loss leader because you're going to be able to sell that solution to all the other operators. Don't ever do that. Make sure that your first business is profitable, every bit of business that you do, because that won't end up being true.
Brilliant advice. So, Vance, where can people find you?
Well, I seem to be the only Vance Shipley on the planet.
That would be true.
But professionally, the best way to find me is through LinkedIn.
Okay. All right. So I really appreciated the insights that you've provided today, Vance, and just blown away by some of the track record of all the things you've done over the years. And yeah, really look forward to working with you in the future. And thank you very much for being a guest.
Absolutely. Good luck with the podcast, and always enjoy talking and interacting with you.
Thanks, Vance, and thank you also for the audience for listening in. Thanks for listening to the Passionate About OSS podcast. You can find more episodes, more than 2,500 blogs, and our contact details over at passionateaboutoss.com.